Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. Ladder Daily Digest normally introduces creators, but today we're going to do something special. First of all, I'd like to welcome our guest host, Sheena Petersen, from the Sheena Petersen podcast. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here with you guys.
And we have Brother Jones back to talk about Meet the Mormons book from 1965. Yeah, a couple weeks ago, Brother Jones and I did a little intro to the book, and you can go back and watch that show, and we'll just dive right in. Okay, Brother Jones?
Sure. All right. Well, I should say that I ran across this book at your house, Gene, and found it an interesting walk through memory lane, you might say. It's a hardbound book published in 1965. This is actually a second edition, published 1966. It's kind of I guess it's not a coffee table book. It's a hot chocolate table book. Is that right? Postum table book, published in 1965. But again, I find there's some very interesting cultural history in this book that I think a lot of younger people may have never seen before. Some of it they will certainly have seen, but I think it's worth going through and looking at a few things which you could say have changed quite a bit in the last decade or so, related to the story of the church. I mean, for one, the title of the book, I guess, wouldn't be so appealing nowadays because the term
Mormon
the term Mormon now is not a good thing. Of course, there was the 2014 movie called Meet the Mormons that came out, and the term Mormons is a bit derogatory now, and some people are offended by it, right? So that's kind of interesting. So this is a pictorial introduction to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint and its people. And I wanted to, one of the first things I want to show in the book is the acknowledgements, which show just how official is this. This unauthorized book. If you look at this acknowledgements, it says numerous agencies and auxiliaries, photographers, artists, and others have cooperated in the preparation of this book. Special appreciation is extended to the First Presidency, the New York World's Fair Committee, Historians Office. Now, the World's Fair was in 1964 in New York, I think. The church had a display there. Anyway, Historians Office, Church Information Service, Improvement Era, Deseret Press, News Press, Building Department, Relief Society Magazine, so Welfare Department, BYU, Glenn E. Nielsen for granted permission to use paintings, photographs, and separation. Photographers and artists, so they're thanking. So my first reaction is the top and the most authoritative people in the church have contributed to this book. It's not a rogue publication. Okay,
right.
Put it that way.
Very official.
Yeah, very, very official.
It's what the leaders of the church wanted to put out to the world.
Yes, that's
what the Mormon church was.
Exactly.
Or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
Its members being Mormons, we'll say.
Yeah. So, of course, there's the contents. I'm gonna first take us to. I mean, this is the traditional narrative. A lot of the imagery and artwork, people who grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s would recognize all of this artwork. It's very kind of the traditional imagery about the establishment of the early church and all that kind of thing. But I want to go to.
Does it mention a great apostasy then?
Yeah, right there it is. Falling away and restoration predicted. Yeah, in fact, they even talk about Martin Luther, early German reformer, posts his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. So that's mentioned. But I'm going to go to page 29. Of course, this is, the classic imagery of the first vision.
And I recognize that picture of Joseph Smith there, that painting. We might have had it in our ward, hung it up somewhere, like the Relief Society room or something. And it seems very familiar to a lot of movies that were produced in the 60s and 70s would have iconography, just very similar to that.
Film strips, yeah. Yep. So I'm going to come to page 29. Let me see here, page 29. There it is. Okay, this is very interesting. As you know, there's the past decade or more. There's been a lot of talk about the translation process in the church finally coming out that it didn't happen this way. But if you look at this, it says a prophet translates the plates, dictating to Oliver Cowdery, who writes in longhand, inset or characters from the plates, which are in a modified or reformed Egyptian. So this actually shows the concept that they were separated by a curtain, right?
Right.
Sheena, did you grow up with that at all?
Yeah, in fact, when a lot of the imagery, even as a kid, I remember like just in the halls of like the different church buildings, and I actually moved around a lot as a kid, so I've been to a lot of different church buildings. They all had these same types of pictures, not this exact one, but usually it's like the one that's kind of more from behind Joseph Smith, where it looks like he's really like working hard at translating those gold plates. And there's like, I think like a little curtain or something right there. But I do remember that being like a big part of the story that I was taught in like primary and everything growing up.
Yeah,
So,
It's kind of interesting with the plates being like scattered around. If I did that, I'd be afraid I'd put them in the wrong order.
I've never seen that before.
3-ring binders.
He just opens it up and this one looks good.
Like, these plates are getting away from me, it looks like. Where was I?
So, the point I want to make is, there's been talk about rogue artists and, artist renditions and they imagine it this way. And so I want to say that it's things like this that create the concepts in our head about how this happened. And as we know, this has been dramatically changed to the point where you have President Russell M. Nelson on video looking into a hat. Okay, that little blurb.
Yeah, I think I can get an access to that, and I'll put it as a link.
Yeah. So that I find it's very interesting. Now I also want to mention. So this is 1965. I'm gonna switch to another PDF real quick.
First, I thought that was Martin Harris on the left-hand side when I first saw that.
Maybe it is. Let me share another.
It wasn't. It was definitely Joseph Smith, but.
Okay, so put that other. There you go. Okay, so many viewers may be familiar with this.
Came out 25 years ago.
Yeah, 25 years ago. It's kind of a popular. It's kind of another. Honestly, it's another postum table book. Okay, it kind of puts pictures in the Book of Mormon. It's a lot of narrative, but again, it's the actual text of the Book of Mormon with all these pictures and stuff. It makes it more interesting, I guess. But here we go, right in here. Again, this is from Bookcraft, 1999. Bookcraft is not, I don't know how or the church is involved with Bookcraft, but or a publishing and distribution
I think they bought out Bookcraft at some point.
No, that may be that sounds right. Anyway, so this is from 1999, Book of Mormon for Latter-day Saint families. And look right in here where they talk about the translation of the Book of Mormon.
Zoom in a little bit on that.
More imagery, showing, and people wonder, well, why did we ever think that this is how it was done? I mean, it was all over the place just 25 years ago. I mean,
so it's like got the curtain, but not in between them necessarily.
Okay. So that I wanted to show that, and then there's a very interesting thing that in here they're showing pictures of other ancient records written on metal plates have been discovered since the publication of the Book of Mormon. This is very interesting because back in I know at least the 70s, I don't know how far back it went, in the country where I served a mission, in the local language Book of Mormon, they actually printed images at the beginning of metal plates of King Darius or something like that. And actually, it'll show it in Meet the Mormons here, and so we'll go back. But they were, they were using this to kind of bolster the idea that ancient records were kept on metal plates. And I think the narrative on this, there's been a backing away of this, and there's been, there's a lot of skepticism, especially about plates in the New World. Okay.
Right.
And I find it interesting that right in this book here, they're showing metal plates to kind of show, other places they've done metal plates, and so it bolsters the idea that the Book of Mormon came from metal plates.
I think
And,
like 100 years ago, some archaeologists were saying, the Book of Mormon story, Joseph Smith's story doesn't add up because we don't find plates anywhere. And so once there's some plates were discovered other places, the church wanted to highlight that this was something that actually was done, in ancient times. And so, there, even just a couple of weeks ago, there was a new set of plates that were found, and people were wondering, what was
where
on
they
those.
were found. They were found in the old world, right?
Yeah, the old world.
In the Middle East. Anyway, yeah. We'll look at that more in just a second. And so, anyway, I think it's an interesting thing as far as how concepts get into the Mormon mind about what happened. These things serve to bolster or to promote an idea which may not be accurate. In fact, it's probably not accurate. But
Sheena, have you ever seen that book at all?
That image of those plates.
This book right here.
That the whole book. Yeah, actually, I think my best friend's family had a copy of that, and we would look through it every now and then.
Yeah, they did a New Testament one. They did a Doctrine and Covenants one, and Old Testament as well. Yeah, they were like $40 or $50 new. And,
so you're rich friends.
Yeah. But I also want to highlight at the end just another page here. There's imagery here. There's a nice painting about Lehi and his family arriving in the Promised Land on this highly sophisticated boat. Okay. Yeah. And if anybody listening, if you've never listened to a podcast called "How to Build a Transoceanic Vessel," look it up. Go listen to it. It's fascinating and worth your time. And I'll just leave it at that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'll try to find it and provide a link to that.
Yeah, easy to find. Let me switch back over to.
Yeah, John Larson describes what it would take for like technology and like metal work and stuff like that in order to build a transoceanic ship, and all the supplies that you have to have on it and stuff like that.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to
Meet the Mormons.
Yeah, back to Meet the Mormons. So anyway, I find it very interesting about the imagery surrounding the translation of the golden plates and what is talked about now. Quite different. Quite different. Okay, so I'm going to take you to another thing that's very interesting. We're going to go to page 38. Okay, 37, 38. Okay. All right. If you can see this, in the 60s, there was clearly a move to tie the concept of the Lamanites, the Book of Mormon, to Central America. Okay. Mm-hmm. In fact, you can even read, if you just read this first paragraph, it says, following the extermination of the Nephite civilization, the Lamanites continued to inhabit the Western Hemisphere. Their posterity with some supplemental groups constituted the many aboriginal tribes, now known as the American Indians, that were found by European discoverers of the New World. Generally not a record-keeping people, and for the most part nomadic. Their culture deteriorated. They lived in cities already built less magnificent structures of their own, often upon the ruins of earlier cities, or more often abandoned sedentary life altogether to follow game trails in the wilderness. It is generally agreed that even the great Incan and Aztec civilizations had declined from the level achieved by their Nephite predecessors. So, all I want to say here, all I want to highlight here is that in this book, it clearly is trying to tie the Book of Mormon story to the ancient civilizations of Central America. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, with the imagery, the pyramids, and all that kind of stuff.
What is that first picture on the left?
That's Machu Picchu.
Yeah, so that's Peru.
So the last city of the Incas in the Peruvian mountains. They were discovered by a young professor from Yale University, Hiram Bingham, in 1911.
Wow.
So
let's ask Sheena. Were you taught about the Lamanites as a young?
Yeah,
woman?
pretty much very similar to what that says there. And of course, like I want to say that I did get a bit more of like this 1960s kind of narrative growing up. And I think it was mostly because of my dad. And because he was a convert to the church, I think in like the early 70s. So this wasn't far after, or he wasn't, he didn't join far after this had come out. And so he had looked into a lot of this stuff. And as a believing member still, like, he always told us growing up and still sticks to this narrative of, oh yeah, like, well, they really came from, South America, and that's where the Lamanites are. And it was like, they were like the Incans and the Aztecs is what I was told. And so I don't remember actually hearing much about that at church though. It was really something that my dad had brought up. So I do find that interesting just because, I think he based a lot of what he taught us on these older books that really weren't brought up as much in class at church for us as youth. So
I'll say that in the 80s there was clearly the idea that what's the, I don't know what the theory is, that the Book of Mormon story took place in Central America, the land north, land south. That was clearly, and of course that narrative has changed.
Right, like the Panama Canal area. Panama was the narrow neck.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now I want to share a quick story. When I was at BYU, I went to BYU in the early mid 90s, we'll say. I was in a class called Western Civ, taught by a man who's now deceased named Ray Matheny. It's all about New World civilizations. And there was a guy in the class who was new to America. He was from South Africa, and he was coming to live the American dream. And he asked the teacher, like, this was like probably in like the first or second week, he raised his hand and he said, so when are you going to like tell us about the connection between the Book of Mormon and, these ancient civilizations, or, these Western civilizations? And I distinctly remember Ray Matheny. You can look him up. He did archaeology and actually had a cover story for National Geographic back in the 70s. He kind of literally whispered under his breath, and he said, there is zero evidence for the Book of Mormon civilization in the New World. And he like whispered that. And I remember stopping and going, how can he say that and be a teacher at BYU? I was like stunned. And of course, you just put it on the shelf and you go about your business for the next 20 years. He told me, he said in this class, in a little bit of a whisper, there is zero evidence of the Book of Mormon civilizations in the New World. And this was at BYU.
Wow.
Okay. So there's that.
And then I noticed below this, it has more of the plates that the other book had.
Yeah, they talk about more of the plates, metal plates used anciently. Again, that's more the idea about, they talk about, in fact, it talks right up in here about King Darius. There's various things. It says, Darius I of Persia, dating back to 518 BC and so on. So I also want to mention this. If any of your listeners are not familiar with a guy named Michael Coe, he's a deceased New World professor from Yale. He was like the world expert in the New World civilizations. He's been interviewed about the connections to the Book of Mormon. He gives very honest. He's just telling you what he thinks. He's very kind. I highly recommend looking up Michael Coe, hearing what he has to say about all this.
I think he was on Mormon Stories with John DeLynn, and I'll include that in the description.
Yeah, it's definitely worth listening to. So again, I find it interesting in this book. There's a clear message. The New World civilization, the Incas, Aztecs, all that stuff down there is evidence for the Book of Mormon. And the experts say there's no connection, and even the church has had to back away, and they don't want to make there's no official statements about this. It's all people in their own mind doing what they want to do.
Right, like
I
the
just-
church would say, all these civilizations are tangentially associated with the Lamanites and the Nephites story. And now they're saying some other things. Sheena?
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to add really quickly too, like I kind of what you're saying about them backing away. I find that so interesting because, yeah, like I was noting before, like I remember hearing this only from my dad. And I kind of wondered about this at church because I always thought it was weird that I would learn these weird things. And I would sometimes bring up some of the things that my dad told me that he had learned from like these older books. And I would bring them up at church and people would be like, no, that's not correct. And this, I don't even remember ever being taught anything like geographically as far as, it being related back to like South America or anything in like Sunday school lessons or young women's or anything like that. It was just a complete focus on the book is true and we don't know about everything surrounding it, like how that all, worked out as far as like the, the areas that these things took place. But they very much just emphasized at that point in my youth growing up, which would have been like the late 90s and like the early 2000s. It was very much just focus on the spiritual messages. So
Right, we don't know where the Book of Mormon geography is.
That's
their official stance.
It seemed to not even be, and I mean, I don't think it was necessarily just the people called to like these positions of teaching were directly told not to, but like you're taught out of the manuals and they go by what's in the manuals. And it seems like probably the manuals had a lot less of that maybe going on in there.
Yeah, back in the 70s, Spencer W. Kimball clearly knew and clearly stated who the Lamanites were. I mean, he made some very specific statements.
Yeah.
And, I find it interesting that today it's like we know less and less. We claim less and less about what we know. And
that's right.
sort
Even
of
the Pacific Islanders were Lamanites.
Yeah,
that's
so,
right. Yeah.
Kind of makes you wonder, right? Okay. Okay, so let's continue on here. We talked about the metal plates used anciently. Okay, there's all of the examples that they're showing in here are old world. There's no new world plate that I'm aware of that go back 2,000 years ago or whatever. Anyway, of course, then there's the story about what happened to the place. It's kind of this the standard narrative that we grew up with,
and also it probably discusses how Joseph Smith translated the Reformed Egyptian into English, King James style, and it has the just above there. It has the witnesses.
Yeah, right here. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It shows the witnesses.
So the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, and they would attest to the fact that these things were exactly what Joseph said they were.
Yeah, learning about that, who actually wrote the statements and all that was very revealing to me. Interesting part of the story, important part of the story. Anyway, it's the Bible and the book. It's to talk about the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And so I want to go to another interesting thing. This is about the churches organized. Going to go to page 50. So this is growth, persecution, and martyrdom. And in here, I'd have to double check. It makes here it is. The Missouri economy was built upon slavery. I'm right down here in this section here. It says oppression of any human being was directly opposed to a basic Mormon belief of freedom for all men. When the Saints got to Salt Lake, I guess that changed. Slavery was okay. I mean, isn't that what the record shows about slavery? So
I know that there was Green Flake, who was a slave that went into the Salt Lake Valley, and they made a movie recently about how he was integral to helping the pioneers come to the Salt Lake Valley, and then Brigham Young freed him a few years later.
Okay, well, so anyway, I find it interesting that they bring up the issue of slavery. Of course, I have to take a closer look. Gene, you can look at it.
That's right, and somewhere in here, there might be in the credits that, this picture of the Kirtland Temple. Is that the Kirtland Temple?
I think so.
This is Nauvoo. This is Kirtland.
Right
Temple
there.
right there.
That at the time of this book, the Kirtland Temple was owned by the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that eventually became the Community of Christ. And just this last month or so ago, the church has purchased it from the Community of Christ, and among some other properties and paraphernalia.
Here on page 51, it mentions something I thought was interesting. It talks about Joseph Smith buying property in Nauvoo for his people. I found that interesting.
Probably one of the middle paragraphs on the right-hand side.
that talks about, the hostilities and opposition to the church developed so rapidly. Well, let me just put it this way. There's 46 times put on trial. That Joseph was not afraid of trial. Some 46 times previously he had been arrested on false charges, but had never been convicted on a single count. Now somehow, in spite of a promise and protection by officials, he knew he would not escape the fury of the mob, which seemed to believe. I guess I was going to mention
that was a big storyline to me, that Joseph Smith was, persecuted, and he was arrested falsely for all these things. Sheena,
Right.
were you taught a similar narrative?
Yeah, I feel like that one has actually been a consistent narrative throughout many of the decades. That, when looking into it further, you get really mad realizing like what all the actual details are, because there's always this kind of generic answer applied to, oh, well, everywhere they went, it was just that like Satan got a hold of like the hearts of everybody around them. And it, like, now when I think about it, it's so ridiculous. It's such bad writing. It's like, that's not even an answer, really. I mean, how is Satan all of a sudden like able to grab hold of people and kind of almost remove agency? I don't know, like it kind of contradicts a lot of what we are taught. So like, the whole thing seemed silly after I started looking at that, but that was a huge part of what we were taught growing up, because they had to make sure that Joseph Smith absolutely was like practically almost Jesus in everyone's eyes. So
that was definitely my experience, that the prophet and the leaders of the church could like do no wrong. Everything they did was in accordance with God's will, and everything going against them was just the acts of Satan, the influence of Satan. That was very clear.
But everything that the church, as the church progressed, every step of the way was led by God doing some miraculous things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it comes through, and that narrative comes through very clearly in this. Let me go to page 50. Oh, I was going to just mention in this section here, growth, persecution, martyrdom, there's not a single mention of polygamy or the Nauvoo expositor.
I can see why.
Not a single mention of that. Okay. Yeah, there's the mob. Yeah, the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. So
that's Liberty Jail there on the left.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to page 62 now. I found this because they talk about the Exodus and going out.
And I remember we were taught that the Exodus was Joseph Smith and Brigham Young all were shown in a vision of the mountains of the Rocky Mountains. In the Rocky Mountains was where the promised land was going to be. Mm-hmm. And then now we find out that some emissaries went to California to see if that would be a good place to go. Some people went to Texas to see if that would be a good place to go. And they were exploring all kinds of different options, compared to just saying it was just the one destination. Salt Lake was in God's and the leader's mind right from the beginning.
There was a section in here, page 63. I'd never really heard this before, and I suspect that an important book that people should at least be aware of, probably hard to find, is called Great Basin Kingdom by Leonard Arrington. It mentions here that the Mormons began the modern irrigation of America. They talk about the handcart companies, talk about the famous Siegel story, but it talks about the irrigation and bringing the valley to. And there's probably some, the Mormon settlement of the West is certainly a major or important part of American history, and of course water rights and all that are key. Access to water rights, all that's a very key element of development of the West. So that I found that kind of interesting that they talk about that. Of course, there's the famous Siegel story, I think, in here, colonization. So anyway, that was just something I found interesting. Okay, here it is. Yeah, page 63. It mentions the William Martin handcart companies. They talk about the immigrants, the Treks back in 847. Everybody should read the book Devil's Gate. If you haven't read that yet, Sheena, get a copy of it and read it. It is an incredible book that explains in detail the William Martin handcart company story.
Okay.
It is incredibly tragic what happened and could have been avoided completely. It could have been avoided.
You said it's called the Devil's Gate?
Called Devil's Gate. Yeah, that's actually
Devil's
a
Gate,
location.
okay.
I want to say it's a location in Wyoming, but
Write that
that's
down so I don't
definitely
forget.
worth the read.
Okay.
Let's continue on in this. Talk about the missionary program. You know, it would be really interesting to see sometime is kind of a history of the growth of the missionary program, like how many missionaries were out any given year over the, when did it really like ramp up? Because I think, anyway, that would be really interesting. I found something very interesting in this. They talk about types of service that were given by missionaries, sharing the message and going out and all that. Now look at this image right here. Missionaries, or if you can see that, it says missionaries strive to serve in many capacities. Often this takes the form of teaching classes or instructing youth in sports. What does that remind you of, Gene?
Yeah. So there were some accusations in the 60s of baseball baptisms in England and soccer baptisms in South American countries.
America, yeah.
Yeah.
I tell you, in the 80s, I don't think that was being done, but English, let me put it this way, teaching English is a major effort among missionaries serving in non-English countries, teaching English. It's a key method for getting in front of people.
About 10 years ago, a friend of mine's daughter went to Mongolia and her passport said, teacher. There was a lot of English teaching going on as part of her. So she wasn't going as a missionary. She was just going as a teacher who just happens to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right. I know of a country where the 80%, 70-80% of a missionary's time is spent teaching English. And honestly, that's a very worthy and excellent way to help people in developing countries, is to teach them English. Because sometimes the cost is prohibitive for them. I did some of that, and I didn't particularly like it because I was constantly being told my job was to baptize people. Now that I think back 30 plus years ago, I wish I had spent a lot more time teaching English. It would have helped more people, I think. I find the thing about sports never came up in the 80s. That was never a thing. Anyway, I found that interesting in the 60s that this is something that they actually talked about serving people through sports education. I found that interesting. Right. So, then they talk about LDS chapels. It's kind of interesting to see the architecture. Again, this is primarily in Utah. There's some that says around the world, but there wasn't a lot of chapels around the world in the 60s.
And back then, in the 50s and 60s, I believe that the local area, the congregations had to come up with a certain percentage of the money in order to build a chapel, to get a chapel built there.
Oh, wow.
They contributed labor.
Wow.
It was a big time to grow chapels. And I think that the person who, when N. Eldon Tanner became an apostle, he was actually brought in to recover financially from something that had happened where they were growing chapels, sort of like build it and they will come. And while it actually did work out for a little while, it was a big strain on the church's finances.
So anyway, it's interesting to see. It's some nice imagery of the older architecture that was being used back then. So there's a very interesting slide here which it shows presidents of the church up through, well, again, David O. McKay was president at this time. Now, if you had told me in 1988 seven of the first nine presidents of the church were polygamists, I would have been like, what? Right?
Yeah.
So on this picture, Heber J. Grant, again, correctly check my information, but he was a polygamist. Heber J. Grant was a polygamist. He was the last polygamist prophet of the church. And I
probably should backtrack a little bit because I knew that the manifesto came out. Who was after Taylor?
That's Lorenzo Snow, 1890.
Who's before Lorenzo Snow?
Wilford Woodruff. I'm sorry, it was
Was it Wilford Woodruff that did the first
You know what? I'd have to double check.
In 1890, yeah, were the first.
I just have
first
to
manifesto, and some people even today don't know that there's sort of 3 manifestos on ending polygamy. The 1890 manifesto did not really end polygamy.
Right.
And
so if anybody wants to read more about this, I highly recommend reading Post Manifesto Polygamy by D. Michael Quinn. It's about a 90-page document, it's about 90 pages. You can find it very easily. Just Google it, read the entire thing, and you'll learn the reality of what happened. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. My point is this: up till Heber J. Grant was a polygamist, and then it's no longer polygamy after that. And notice, the beards go away. We got David O. McKay is the first no beard prophet besides Joseph Smith. The image of the church begins to change dramatically. Now, I also want to mention this. Many of you may remember Gordon B. Hinckley going on 60 Minutes, or I think it was 60 Minutes, and mentioning how, the fundamentalists and the polygamists have nothing to do with the church and all that. I just find that very disingenuous now, knowing that polygamy was going on clear into the 1940s.
Recently had lunch with some missionaries, and I brought up the polygamy, and they said, "Oh, that was just something that happened in the past."
Right.
And it's not like it was. It's not doctrine, right? It was just something they did back then. And I said, "Well, you should read section 132 in the Doctrine of Covenants all the way through in one sitting.
Yeah.
You'll see that it was doctrine."
And technically still is, because it's still in their canonized scripture.
Still in the scripture.
Yeah. So anyway, I find that very interesting. Again, a lot of times what is not said is as important as what is said.
Yeah.
So okay, one more thing on leaders. And again, this is 1965, 66. Look at this picture of the Council of the 12 Apostles. Again, there's 12 men here. I find it interesting. 7 of these 12 became presidents of the church after David O. McKay. You have Joseph Fielding Smith, Harold B. Lee, Spencer W. Kimball up until 1985. Then you have Benson until 94, I think it was. And then you have Howard W. Hunter, Gordon B. Hinckley, Thomas S. Monson. So if you wonder why it takes so long for things to change in the church, I mean, you're talking about leaders this was their heyday, 60 years ago, 60, 70, 80 years ago was their time. So anyway, I find that interesting. Continue on page 98, and it talks about some of again, this is all cultural imagery, classic LDS home and family, and then the temples, the early temples. Of course, the temples are in the news a lot nowadays.
Well, Nathan, scroll up a little bit again. Scroll back up. The black and white picture in the middle. Are there any ethnicities represented in any of these pictures?
In the top right, there's a looks like somebody in Asia. That's somebody in Asia. Yeah.
Asia.
I mean, certainly they wanted to portray worldwide and diverse and all that, but it was very minimal. If you actually look at the numbers, I mean, up until the church
pictures
really wasn't international until the 60s or 70s, really.
The pictures of the missionaries going forth showed all the different nations that they were
into,
but they're not showing members necessarily.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I understand that. That's just propaganda. I understand.
I just would have thought they would have shown more like Latin families in some of these pictures.
But minimal. I mean, it's okay. That's to be expected in the 60s, I would say. Let me show you real quick. Of course, they show some of the temples. I find this interesting. Of course, that I did not know until recently that the height of the spire is like a doctrinal thing. Now, apparently, that's a key part of Mormonism. That's news to me.
There's 3 underperforming.
The Arizona temple, the Alberta temple don't even have spires. And so
those are underperforming temples.
Yeah, I guess.
The blessings there aren't quite as good.
they're not quite as close to God as all the other temples, you know.
Yeah.
The
There's my
height makes
temple.
the difference.
There you go. So anyway, I find that interesting. It does go in it talks about the welfare program. That's an interesting thing. And here's some more great imagery of the kind of the idealized Mormon wards. That's obviously changed dramatically. But
Yeah, lots of youth. Zoom in on that one bigger picture of the congregation.
right here. Oh, sure. Right here. Yeah. It doesn't. This is great. I mean, that's fine. I mean, it probably was like that back in the 60s.
Sure.
bit.
Like I say, when I was a deacon's quorum president, we had 24 names on the rolls of deacons in our ward. There were lots of families that had 5, 6, 7, 8 kids.
Yes. It also talks about the Sunday activities, and this will explain a little bit about the old schedule before the 3-hour block. Talks about sorry about the noise. It talks about the priesthood and Sunday school in the morning, and then it talks about the split schedule that we used to do, and then primary used to be during the week,
And
which is
Relief
kind
Society.
of interesting. Yeah. I have vague memories of that. Yeah. Okay.
Does it talk about the Relief Society?
I'd have to look. I'd have to take some more time to look. I'm sure it does.
Let's scroll down.
This is the primary program.
Organization.
We all remember flannel boards, right?
Right.
I like this one here. Pinewood Derbies. Cub Scouts and fathers join for an evening of fun. There's the Pinewood Derby. I want to mention this. A lot of us who are older remember all of the kind of the social activities, and with a lot of that's gone away. The social activities, road shows, musicals, those kind of things. And of course, scouting. We know scouting's gone. Scouting was a big part of my youth experience.
Yeah.
So it talks about the vibrant youth program, and I would have to say that's changed dramatically in the last 10 years.
Maybe the women's organization is going to be next.
Oh, here we go. Yeah. Women render service, seek self-improvement. Okay. That kind of stuff. All right. Education and the church are some, they want to showcase Brigham Young University. I will also add, this is kind of interesting. Here in the bottom right is the campus of the church, the Church College of New Zealand and New Zealand Temple near Hamilton. My understanding that is gone. This school no longer exists, or it's been or no
sold off or something
like that. Yeah.
No longer connected to the church directly.
I haven't heard of that.
Yeah. There's the Church College Hawaii. This is before it was BYU Hawaii, I guess.
So there's some ethnic representation here.
Sure, yeah. They talk about Pacific and the Orient. So that's kind of interesting. All right, we'll conclude. There's a couple more things. Here's the world famous Mormon Tabernacle Choir.
Say the name of that.
The world famous Mormon Tabernacle Choir.
It has a nice ring to it.
Yeah, what's what the book says. But it interestingly enough, it says the best known of all LDS singing groups is the world famous Salt Lake Tabernacle Choir. So I'm not quite sure what the official name was at this time.
Yeah, it probably was the Salt Lake Tabernacle Choir, and then it had a nickname. But since everybody knew the nickname, that would go up on the playbills whenever they would tour, probably.
Yeah, that's And of course, they mentioned singing at Eisenhower's invitation to the choir is sung for President Eisenhower, President Lyndon B. Johnson, and the White House in Washington at the White House in Washington D.C. President Johnson's inauguration, the Seattle and New York World Fairs, the first Telstar satellite international broadcast, and has won numerous honors and awards. That's kind of an interesting thing that the name was changed, as we know. Last thing I want to mention. This is an issue. So in the epilogue here, it says here, the message we have sought to present is that God has spoken in our day through living prophets, restored his gospel in its beautiful and fullness, and reestablished his true church for the blessing and salvation of his children. Now, as we know now, that the party line, the official line, is that it's an ongoing restoration. Maybe it's just a little technicality, but that's a distinctly different message than restored in its fullness. Anyway, I find all of this an interesting walk down memory lane.
Yeah, well,
thanks.
Thanks, Brother Jones, for covering all those interesting things. I'm sure there are plenty of people in our audience that might remember, or at least their parents or grandparents would have remembered this book. It kind of was sort of like the beginning of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints gaining like world acceptance from being the cast off, polygamists to a more of a mainstream display, and was such a good nickname that for 40 years, 50 years even, the I'm a Mormon campaign in the 2010s was very prominent. Lots of money spent on that campaign. And it's still up on YouTube. You could still look up all the I am a Mormon.
According to Gregory Prince, who wrote a book about David O. McKay, he was really the first modern. David O. McKay brought the church into the modern era, and he died in 1970. It was January 1970. So this book came out while he was president. Again, as we know, the image of the church is a paramount concern. Yeah. And this is an effort to polish that image. Anyway, I think there's a lot of interesting things in here that are worth looking at. And
I remember as a child, I remember as a child looking through this book and having lots of pride, right? I was a Mormon, and here's big buildings, here's the gospel being spread, here's the story of our church being spread to the world through this book. It was a point of pride to see this. And the church was growing in the 60s and 70s. It was amazing to hear the announcement of the growth of the church. Every year we would hear the report on membership. There even was you could still find it, I think, on YouTube. A membership report from like 1971 was 5 minutes long. It said something like there are 500,017 members of the teacher program and stuff like that.
So times have changed.
Yeah. So Sheena, what are your thoughts about this?
I mean, there's definitely stuff in there that was not integrated into my learning growing up in the church. And I do recognize a lot of these pictures, though. Like, there are quite a few in here that definitely the church has just reused and printed in their manuals and different things throughout my lifetime and stuff, but yeah, I mean, I feel like the focus for us as youth growing up, and I feel like it was mostly always just on the spiritual aspect of things and not so much on the details of the history. And I don't even remember even having very much discussion through my youth or even in like the adult classes about church history that much. It was always it was overly simplistic, like, kind of like what we talked about with, everywhere the saints moved, like everyone around them became the bad guy. It was just kind of silly stuff like that. So, but they never dove deep into anything. And that always bothered me, especially because like finding out about some of this stuff, because they've never fully hidden the polygamy. I don't think that they really ever could. But kind of going back to that, when we were talking about that, that was something that had always kind of vexed me as a teenager and young adult, because I was like, I can't believe that I am just finding out about this now when I'm about, 17, 18, whatever it was. And then every time, anytime church history ever was touched upon, or like we would get into Doctrine and Covenants, because they do like their yearly rotation through the different, books of scripture, they skip over all those things because it's too controversial. So yeah, it was always like, oh, just focus on the spiritual messages. So this is interesting. I never had heard about or really had learned much about missionaries having the duty to teach English or sports or whatever. That was kind of interesting. And yeah, didn't know about the church school in New Zealand that's not there anymore. I never heard about that.
In South Pacific Islands, there's been schools in South Pacific Islands too.
Interesting.
Owned and run by the church. Yeah. All I gotta say, Gene, let me come back here. I'll end on a little bit of humor. When I'm 85, I hope I'm as buff as Mormon is.
Arnold Freeberg.
Anyway,
Yeah, we had Books of Mormon that had those pictures in it, those missionary handout books, sort of, and they were impressive to look at. And I think Steve Pinecker of Mormon Book Reviews talks about how he had a book with all those pictures in it, and it really grabbed his attention to see all those handsome, strapping, strong men displayed in the Book of Mormon. It was just fascinating to see those pictures.
Yeah,
Thanks,
the youngsters,
Sheena.
those things they put, they bring to life the story.
Right.
That's the intention of it. And
thinking about epic movies like Ben-Hur and the Charlton Heston one,
The 10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments, we'd watch every year, like right around April, around Easter time and things like that. And those big epic movies were portrayed by those pictures as the Book of Mormon is just as epic as all those other Hollywood productions in a way. And so Arnold Freeberg really brought that out. Well, yeah, thanks, Sheena, for co-hosting for the first time.
Thank you. This is exciting.
Yeah, and everybody go to the Sheena Petersen podcast. We'll have a link to that as well. And thanks, Brother Jones, for your presentation. I looked through the book a lot when I was a young, 65. So I was maybe a young teenager when I would look through that for the first 10 years that we had it. And I haven't really touched it since. And it was at my mom's house, and she passed away 9 years ago. And I was able to retrieve it from maybe the garbage dump it might have ended up in if I hadn't, picked it out of there. And it's a really cool, it's basically how Mormonism was when I was a young man. It's very interesting to see that. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and share. Sharing is a very important thing. We do have a tip jar down in the description. And hopefully that somebody someday will give us, a quarter or something like that. Good. It'll be exciting. It'll be an exciting day. I remember going to like grocery stores or businesses, and they'd have like their first dollar bill in a plaque on their wall. And so I can't wait to do that someday for Ladder Daily Digest. But everybody have a good spring, and we're looking forward to the summer coming pretty soon, I hope. All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Bye.